Good morning, Shindo. Again, this morning giving you the news you will not hear anywhere else. News media in this country is more interested in hyperbole coming out of Donald Trump's mouth than actual news of what's going on in the world when we are at the brink of war. Again, this is being ignored. So if you want this news, you need to subscribe to my channel. You need to like my videos. Otherwise, it will be buried just like it's buried by the media here in the West. Continuing with NATO. Ukraine joining NATO would be trigger for war with Russia. This is 2 hours ago. News.com.au. It's the nightmare scenario Europe and the rest of the West is dreading. An aggressive Moscow unleashes its military might, plunging Europe and the world into chaos. But despite fears of potential war would include nuclear weapons, an Australian expert and former spy thinks there is far more likely outcome, and it's almost as terrifying. Quote, the red line in the sand is if NATO makes Ukraine a member, unquote, Professor Paul Dibb, an Australian-Russian expert, told the news.com.au. Quote, that will be seen as a call for war, unquote. That's the moment that would force Russia's hand and make war almost inevitable. But Professor Dibb doesn't agree with former NATO chief's prediction that meant Russia would use its nuclear arsenal. In May, General Sir Richard Sheriff stoked nuclear fears when he warned Europe would be locked in nuclear war with Russia within a year. An Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies in the Australian National University, Professor Dibb, said Russia remains one of the biggest threats to international world order today. Professor Dibbs, who lives a double life as an informer for ASIU against the Soviets from 1965 until 1984, said nuclear war with Russia was not an impossibility. However, he maintains the bigger and more likely threat to peace would be the issue of NATO and the Ukraine. Such a move would convince Putin that Russia didn't have to tolerate U.S. and NATO forces right on his doorstep. This in turn could have repercussions for Australia, with the U.S. forces to pour more resources into stabilizing Europe and less into maintaining security in the South China Sea. Professor Dibbs said this would therefore mean any issues arising in China and across the Pacific would take a back seat. Ambitious Putin. According to Professor Dibb, Putin regards the disintegration of the Soviet Union as one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century. Quote, Putin saw it as Russia not, quote, only being robbed but plundered, unquote, he said. Putin is not only ambitious but patriotic, something he seems to rile up in his fellow countrymen. Quote, Russians do not believe territories like Crimea belong to the Ukraine, but rather to them, unquote, he said. Professor Dibb said some Russians didn't accept the view that Ukraine has a right to exist as a separate country and definitely didn't belong in NATO. Ukraine applied to join NATO membership action plan in 2008, but the idea was shelved 2 years later. Professor Dibb admits Russia's nuclear capabilities would be a concern for NATO forces. Another concern was that despite the Russian economy being in trouble, Putin could use NATO-Ukraine card to justify spending on a war. And also, by the way, the United States would love it too. These things are being done so that people can keep their eye off the ball, and the ball being the economic collapse, which is coming soon. Just last month, Professor Dibb voiced concern about Russia's ambitions in the article of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. In Why Russia is a Threat to the International Order, he wrote, "There was no doubt that Putin's Russia is seeking to reinsert itself as a major power." He said it was also clear Russia could overwhelm any of its neighbors militarily if they were isolated from Western support. Quote, "The most important political factor is the role of President Vladimir Putin, who's determined to reassert Russia's major power status and recover its standing in the Eurasian geopolitical space." He said many Russians today regard the Soviet Union as a country to be respected and feared, and their leader played on this. Nuclear war. In his warning, General Sheriff said Europe could be locked in a nuclear war with Russia, quote, "within a year," unquote, triggered by a Russian incursion into the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The retired general said he had a, quote, "an awful vision of the Baltic states being seized," unquote, and NATO being unable to respond due to Russia having nuclear weapons. NATO's not going to respond. NATO's not going to respond. It doesn't matter what Russia does. And Putin knows this. His prediction is the basis for his book, With Russia, which is a fictional account of how nuclear war in the continent could unfold. However, according to Brinsby-based observer of international relations, Nikola Merskin, such an idea is raised in the book only serves to, quote, "tap into populist sentiment building on the usual alarmist Cold War narrative," unquote. The doctoral candidate at the University of Cambridge, an associate member of the RMIT University's Center for Global Research, said the narrative is apparently gaining traction in the Western sanctions. Keep pushing Russia into China's embrace. However, he agreed with author sentiment that, quote, "we mustn't allow ourselves to sleepwalk into another conflict," unquote. Quote, "Peace needs to be protected by all parties involved, not unilaterally, and this can't be achieved through alarmism and reckless escalation," unquote, he said. Quote, "When facing accusations coming from the West, Moscow's decision makers can always counter by a map of numerous U.S. NATO military bases in countries around Russia, which certainly contribute to Moscow's insecurity and perceptions about U.S.-inspired regime changes, and in turn to another escalation spiral, rather than the peace these bases claim to establish," unquote. Tough talk. Russia's tensions with Ukraine have escalated this week following a war of words over Crimea. Those tensions hit boiling point yesterday when Ukraine put its troops on combat alert along the country's de facto border with Crimea. Ukraine President Petro Poroshenko issued the orders after Moscow accused his country of sending several groups of, quote, "saboteurs," unquote, to carry out attacks on Crimea, claiming that the two Russians died while fending off their incursions. Ukraine has denied the claim, calling them, quote, "a fantasy" and, quote, "a provocation." Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine in March 2014 following a hastily called referendum. A conflict between Russia-backed separatists and Ukrainian forces flared up in eastern Ukraine weeks later. The conflict, which is still ongoing, has killed more than 9,500 people. Meanwhile, Russian media reports say at least 5 members of the sabotage group were captured. One of the suspects claimed he was part of the group preparing to conduct acts of sabotage, and that his group was directed by Ukraine military intelligence, included some of its officers. Russian President Vladimir Putin denounced what he described as Ukraine's, quote, "stupid and criminal," unquote, action, and called a session of the Security Council on Thursday to discuss boosting security in Crimea. Poroshenko ordered Ukrainian troops to go on combat alert not only on the de facto border with Crimea, but also along the line of contact in eastern Ukraine, where the warring sides have continued to routinely exchange fire despite a 2015 truce. Now, there is not a day that goes by that I don't check out the news in the morning. Most of us have to work during the day. So the news that we get is going to be in the morning. Most of us, maybe just me, doesn't spend all their time checking out news when they're at work. I mean, it must be nice to be able to have a job where you could do that, but I don't. So a lot of us, at least, get our news in the morning, and the news in the morning is fluff, and it's politics, and it's nonsense. Instead of them giving the actual news, there was a time when news sources actually gave news. To say that the United States is at the brink of a new Cold War with Russia is not an understatement. To say that the United States may very well find itself in an actual land war against Russia, at least by proxy, within the next couple of years, is not an understatement either. Yet, this news is not being covered. I have to read this from an Australian source. The United States of America has become such a country of idiocracy. As the rest of the world, it seems, is at the brink of war. Russia making an alliance, mentioned in this, that Russia is being pushed into the arms of China. Russia making an alliance with China would be extremely dangerous to the West. And while all of this is going on, you tune into the news this morning, and all you're going to hear is the latest hyperbole and their overreaction to some nonsense that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth. If you want news, subscribe to my channel, like my videos. Otherwise, these will be buried, and with it, the real news. This is Shindo. Have a good day. 'Cause you